Hello everybody and welcome to GM Magic, the series where I am going to try and unburden some of the terrible GMing secrets that are weighing me down. Seriously, I have a need to share these with you guys. I thought we'd start with quite a safe, controversial issue, which is narrative control. Roll credits, baby. Hello everybody, my name is Joshua Crisp and I have been running D&D and games like it for the past...
Who can say where the road goes, where the day flows, only time.
15, that's right, for 15 years. I would like to share my experience with you to make you a better GM or a better player, or both. What narrative control is the question of whose story is it anyway? It could be the player's story, where they get together and you as the GM provide a world for them to traipse about and decide that they want to become the king. Fab. Or it could be the GM's story, where they put together a narrative and the players participate and shape it to some extent. But the question is, how much should the players be able to influence the narrative? Way back when D&D first came out in date, the idea was that a DM would present a dungeon to the players, and the reason for exploring the dungeon was it was there. It was full of monsters and treasure, and that was sufficient motivation. The players would turn up with their characters, which usually you could transfer between different DMs, game to game, and they would run through the dungeon. And depending on how nice the DM was, the monsters would be harder or less hard to defeat. Sometimes there'd be nobility who would turn up and give you quests, maybe a wise old wizard, or your tavern would get attacked by ninja, but the motivations of these characters were never really in question. There's gold in them there dungeons, let's go get it. Nowadays, the experience of old Dungeons and Dragons is probably best simulated in a computer game. And that's not a wrong way to play D&D. But nowadays, there are board games that do that and require a lot less intensive preparation. And then there are computer games that offer you the narrative run-through that those games can offer while still having the combat crunch. So why play Dungeons and Dragons? Fundamentally, the reason to play Dungeons and Dragons or any other RPG, pen and paper, with your friends, is narrative control. No matter how well programmed a computer game, if you decide you are going to assassinate the king and then wear his clothes around the house and tell everybody that you're his long-lost identical twin, you can attempt to pull that off. And depending on how you roll and what the sensibilities and tone of your game are and whether you have a forgiving GM, maybe you'll get away with it. It's the potential for the players to completely take control of the narrative that makes role-playing games unique. So how much control should you give your players? Well, there's two sides to this. There is the tyranny of DM Fiat, and then there is the chaos of no GM. Usually, a group wants to settle somewhere on the spectrum between the two. It is possible you will find a group of players who simply want to turn up and be told an amazing story. They enjoy the way that they are immersed in the world, they like making choices in combat, they like making minor choices, but they don't want to have too much control over the plot. So it is imperative, and this will be on my big list of GM things you must have. One of those is definitely you need to know how the session goes, assuming the players do not do anything. If a character says, I'm going to ascend to godhood now, you are within your rights as a GM to say, no, this does not happen. And if it's impossible according to the physics of your world, that's fine. That doesn't break anybody's immersion. If somebody says, I would like to jump to the moon, you say, okay, you can't jump to the moon. Fine. But if they want to make the attempt, that's fine too. You say, okay, you try and jump to the moon, and lo and behold, you have failed to do so. Everybody around laughs. No problems. Okay, that's fine. That is a failure state within the world. The player made a choice, you adjudicated it, you tried to work it out, maybe you called for a dice roll, and then you resolved it and described it. That's exactly GMing 101. It is reasonable to set limitations on the actions your player characters can feasibly achieve. When there is a disconnect between the style of game that the GM wants to run and the style of game that the players want to experience, eventually and inevitably, they will collide. And when they do, the group is going to tear itself apart because the players are wanting to play something the GM doesn't want to run. They want to play a horror game. Or they want to play a lot of mysteries and investigation. They always want to ask questions and interact with NPCs and try and uncover clues. And the GM wants to run a let's go murder everything in a dungeon and get the gold. Both of these are fine styles of game, but when they clash and neither side is willing to compromise, you get conflict. The easiest resolution for this is to have a session 0. Have a pitch for your game. Gather your players, maybe in a pub, maybe at your regular gaming group after you finished a campaign, and say, all right, guys, this is my idea for the game. I want to tell a story that is broadly about these things. I want to explore this kind of theme and give your players a tonal idea of where you're drawing inspiration from. If you want to run a great big high fantasy heroic adventure, you want to say, okay, I want to run like Lord of the Rings. Think Lord of the Rings, that's the kind of game I want to run. Maybe you want to run an urban mystery magic fantasy thing going with the Dresden Files as your inspiration. That's cool. Maybe you want to run a grimdark, hyper-modern Matrix Corporation Shadowrun kind of thing. Fab, right? All of these are fine games, but the players need to know, because if one player has turned up going, I'm in Assassin's Creed, and another player has turned up going, I'm in Conan the Barbarian, and another player has turned up going, I'm in the Teletubbies, your game is going to fall apart because everybody's going to be doing things that are going to annoy everybody else. The most important thing to do is make sure that all your players are on the same page tonally. And that includes how much ability the GM has to say, no, that doesn't fit with the tone of the game. Because you are many things as a GM, you are an impartial arbiter, but that means that you are a judge as well. It is your job to adjudicate and then enforce the law. So, on the one hand, the tyranny of DM Fiat, where the DM simply says, this is the story, pawns, move along, and when the players try and be creative or inventive, and they try and come up with their own solutions to the problems the GM has thrown at them, the GM says, nope, that is not the solution that I have come up with. And this problem comes up quite a lot when new GMs are running published modules. There is a wealth of wonderful content, some of which is produced by Wizards of the Coast for Dungeons & Dragons, and there's a whole bunch of amazing third-party content up on a site called the DM's Guild, link in the description. If you don't want to create your own stuff, use theirs. There's loads of it. Get yourself a short module, read it start to finish and go, I understand the plot. It is a pre-written roleplay plot. Absolutely fantastic. The problem is that it usually has a fairly linear structure of plot by definition, right? As soon as you take anything and write it down, it's like you've made a computer program. It has barriers, it has limitations, it has walls beyond which there is nothing written. And if you've got a creative group, they're going to bounce up pretty hard against those walls. They're going to go, well, what if I try and seduce the king? And you're going to look at the module and it's going to have exactly no help for you. And at that point, there is the art of compromise. Because if you allow your players to seduce the king, the game may take a real tangent and go off in a direction that the module can provide you very little assistance. They may not engage with any of the rest of the material in that module, and if you continue to try and shoehorn it back in, that might be difficult. If the players have decided that they want to play the court intrigue game when they sat down to a game which you had bought as a murder mystery, right? It's going to change the dynamic of the game. Sometimes that's fine. I think my personal advice is most of the time, lean into it. Whenever your players are providing you with plot, that's a good thing. It means they're invested in the game. It means that they actually want to make an impact in your story, that you have presented a world that is real enough and engaging enough that other human beings are invested. But the flip side of that is don't just say yes to everything your players suggest, because your players are not running the game. You are running the game. You are providing them with the world to play in, and you are telling them a story. And if your players are trying to do things which really dramatically do not fit with the tone, style, theme of game you're running, you can just say no. Do not feel obliged to offer them a dice roll, because what if they get a critical success and everyone at the table starts celebrating? You need to just feel comfortable enough to say, no, you can't do that, but you can do something else instead. Take their suggestion on board, tell them it's appreciated, encourage them to continue to invest in your world, but tell them that sadly this time ain't the time it's going to work. Nice idea though. If you want a GM-less game, there are plenty of those out there. In those games, the players all come together. They're usually one-shot games, though not always. The players come together and they build a story together. These games are great, and everybody is excited and interested in telling the story together, and they often go really silly places because of course they do. And there are a plethora of them. I think my very favourite is Fiasco. If you really like GM narrative control and you want to turn up and be told a really engrossing story with fun twists and plot turns that have been scripted and have encounters and combats that have been designed specifically to challenge you, published modules for D&D are a great way to go. They're absolutely brilliant. You buy something like the Tyranny of Dragons or Ghost of Saltmarsh. Actually, Ghost of Saltmarsh is interesting. It's got a collection of different adventures rather than one great big long epic, so you can slot them into other campaigns. I recommend it. It's pretty cool. But Tyranny of Dragons or Dragon Heist. Dragon Heist is great. There's a bit of choice in there. The players can go, oh, well, maybe we'll do this or maybe we'll do that. But their choices are pretty linear and clear. They can go down path A or path B or path C. Effectively, the whole adventure is a dungeon. And it is understood in a dungeon that the players aren't going to start tunneling through the walls. Because while they can, it creates such a workload on the GM that it's part of the table contract that the players aren't going to do that. Because the GM needs to have fun as well. Okay, so in conclusion, if you as a GM have too much control, your players will feel frustrated. They will feel like none of their ideas mean anything. They will feel like they may as well be reading a book. They will feel like they cannot contribute to the story that is unfolding, which their characters are, in theory, a part of. That sucks for everybody. But if you allow your players too much control, you run the risk that your narrative will be unsatisfying. If you sculpt a narrative, you can put in pinch points, moments of tension and then moments of relaxation. You can decide when you're going to spend time examining the scenery and exploring the culture and the world, and when you're going to zoom right in and have an epic, exciting combat. You can build everything, hopefully, to a nice, satisfying narrative climax. You can build to a finale, and that is so important that I cannot do it in this video. And as long as everybody's on the same page before you start, you will have many fewer instances of GM-player conflict over control of the narrative. I've been Joshua Crisp, this has been GM Magic, and you can catch my D&D stream on Twitch, link below. Like, share, subscribe, and as always, keep rolling them dice. Bye-bye! Hello everybody and welcome to GM Magic, the place where we teach you how fingers work. Hello everybody and GM. Okay. We are adults and professionals.